Welcome to the Retaining WIT podcast. I'm Jossie Haynes.
And I'm Jordanna Kwok.
This show tackles the challenges of keeping women in tech.
Each episode, we discuss current events, experiences in the industry, and what it takes to create a workplace where women will thrive.
Hey, welcome to our last episode of Season 2 for the Retaining WIT podcast. We're recording this here in end of April. It's finally starting to warm up a little bit here in the Silicon Valley, so I'm looking forward to some nice sun. But before we wrapped up our season, Jordanna and I wanted to share a little bit of a recap, talk about what's been going on since the beginning of the season, share about industry events, and then chat a little bit about generative AI. So much has been going on with ChatGPT and Bard and Bing and all the image generation. So we definitely wanted to touch on that. So why don't we get started? Jordanna, it's great getting to chat with you today.
Yeah, I'm so happy that we've been able to touch on so many topics in the past several months. From breaking through as a technical woman, this is our conversation with Bhavna Bhatnagar, to managing performance in uncertain times with Teresa Martini. So I think we covered such a wide range of topics amidst a lot of uncertainty in the industry today. And some of the ones that are ongoing, for example, layoffs continuing. I believe this week we had Lyft. I think it was like 1,200 individuals being let go, and then a second round of layoffs at Meta. So I think a lot of the tips that our guests who have come on have provided will be helpful to our listeners.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we did a little differently this season, which I think really worked, was making sure we had an overall topic for each of our guests. And so I think we've got some really interesting deep dive conversations because we did that.
Yeah. And definitely looking forward to next season, where I'm sure within the time that we wrap up and when we start again, a lot will have happened. And yeah, we'll see in the industry how far we will have gotten, especially around generative AI.
Absolutely. And, you touched on in the industry news a second round of layoffs at Meta. And one of the things that very much disappointed me was it was another email round of layoffs at Meta. And, one of the things we talk about so often in this podcast is how are we building inclusive cultures? And it just frustrates me that we've got all of these companies insisting, hey, let's get people back into the office because FaceTime is important, right? And hey, I'm not arguing about the value of FaceTime here, but you can't say that and then just fire everybody via email. Like it's actually a little sad seeing the fact that a lot of our friends have PTSD about checking their email first thing in the morning because they're worried it's not going to work.
Yeah, and I think the communication at many of the larger companies going through this, it's not very transparent. So, there is no certainty that another round wouldn't be coming. So you're always constantly checking behind your back, is this coming, and trying to prepare for that. It's not really helpful for productivity, that's for sure. And it takes a lot of emotional energy away from your day-to-day work.
Absolutely. And, touching on some other industry events that have definitely been distracting people is, we had the SVB bank failure about a month ago. And if we hadn't had that government bailout, that would have been disastrous for not just small startups, but larger companies as well, who, there was hundreds of millions of dollars invested within tech at SVB. And so I think you're right. There's going to be a lot of change between now and when we start up our next season. And so, like I said, let's dive into talking about generative AI. But before we do that, why don't we both give a quick update on what's been going on in our life and work since we had started this season? Jordanna, you're actually approaching 6 months at Airbnb now.
Yeah, I started last November, so approaching 6 months. And it has been, I would say, a wild ride trying to learn everything, learn a new culture, get my feet wet in terms of product development there. Also learning about the tech stack. There's just so much going on that I forget how exciting it is when you start at a new company that there are all these new things. I felt like the sponge trying to soak in all the information. That was something that was certainly missing. I had mentioned previously I spent 9 years at Netflix, and when you spend that long at a company, you do kind of slow down a little bit in terms of what you're learning because you've learned so much already. And yeah, this was definitely the change I needed. So, what about you, Josie? How's your coaching and advising business going?
It's going really well. So I'm at the 9 month mark now. By the time this comes out, I'll have hit a year and I'm loving it. Similar to what you mentioned, I am learning a ton. Running a business is a whole new skill set to grow and learn. And I realized so much of it is about mindset and just really getting out of your own head. I think especially as with the engineering logical background, I love to optimize things. But one of the big things that I've learned in running a business is it is so much better to just get something out there and hear feedback and see what resonates and what sticks. And small daily consistencies can be actually much more impactful than trying to optimize and build this perfect thing. So I think for me, that has honestly been my biggest learning. And it's actually why my business has grown so successfully. And so, my focus, I've also shifted a little bit. My mission is still retaining women in tech, but I really realized I love coaching women leaders. And so that's really been my focus much more so than the advising side, even though I do still have a couple advising clients. And now that I've filled up my one-on-ones, I'm actually launching a group program. I'm actually going to launch two group programs, actually. One for women leaders. And actually, I've had so many folks in the last even couple of weeks asking me how I've grown my business so quickly. So I'm actually going to start a little group mastermind for other people who want to be coaches and teach them some of the learnings I've had, because I feel like so much of if you follow like the business gurus and stuff, they tell you like you have to create these crazy funnels and all of these things. And ultimately, if you're trying to build a one-on-one coaching practice for like technology leaders, you don't need most of the stuff that they're trying to sell you. It's just we get addicted to it because, again, we want to build something because we've been previously taught that building things is how we build our outcomes. But literally, to be successful, you need one, some way to be having conversations with your ideal audience. Two, a way to kind of get your voice out there. And then three, doing the mindset work to make sure that things are going well. Like ultimately, if you have those three things and then a program that is helping your clients, that's all you need. You don't need some crazy group or funnel or all of these things that a lot of the business gurus who are trying to get people to build 200 or 1,000 people businesses need. But if you're looking to coach like 10 to 20 people a year, you can build a much simpler business. So those have been my learnings along the way.
That's really exciting. You're almost doing like meta program where you're coaching coaches or potential coaches. So that's pretty cool. Yeah, I definitely am imagining the types of clients that you might be getting right now, especially in these challenging times where it might be women who are struggling dealing with perhaps it's resource constraints, or they have been let go themselves and really trying to get back on their feet. And I know that's been pretty challenging. So I'm really glad that you've been able to help a lot of them.
Yeah, and it really does kind of fall into those two buckets like you said, right? It's people who are trying to find that next role and really helping them realize that if you can let go a little bit of the grasp on the goal, it actually ends up being much more successful. And I think a lot of times people need some help with working kind of through that to really actually have their job search be a success. And I think one of the things I realized, even with folks who aren't just looking for that next job right now, so many people are trying to figure out what's next. And we've been taught in this industry that what's important is title and salary, right? And so I've really been pushing people to explore, but what else? How do you actually want to feel? What do you want to be spending your days doing, right? Because guess what? At the end of your life, when you're on your deathbed, you're not going to be looking back and saying, I wish I worked more. And so often, though, we're not thinking about this holistically. And so that's one of the things I've really loved about coaching people is getting them to start thinking about not just like, how do you get that next title? And I mean, obviously, it's important. I want people to progress in their careers, but I also want them to be happy overall. And so, like, that's been the thing that really makes me happy and why I keep doing this.
Yeah, and leadership legacy. That's
Yes.
how I think about
Yep.
it. And you really need to step back to kind of really examine your own life. It's not work, it's life. Like what do you
Exactly.
want your legacy to be? And so, yeah, that's a amazing service that you're providing.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's fun. Like that's the other thing for me, and I really have been thinking about this as well. Is like, what is my vision? And you know what? I definitely want to change the world and help people, but I want to have fun doing so. Like I want to enjoy life, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think so many of the women I talk to are so used to putting themselves last behind work and family and their career and everything else that shows up on the list. And then I ask them like, what do you want? And they're like, nobody's ever asked me that question. I'm like, we each should be asking ourselves that question on a regular basis, right? Because if not, we're just kind of living through life and letting everybody else's decisions impact us instead of us getting to lead the way.
Yeah. Speaking of what we are looking for in life, both of us mentioned growing and learning. So, one of the things that I've been really learning about lately is AI, especially generative AI, just because the ChatGPT, I think it came out late last year. Huge hit in terms of a product and followed quickly by Bing. Now we have Bard, but also a lot of the other generative AI services for images. I think I've seen some for video and voice. Like you could literally take our podcast recordings and throw it into a model and have it regenerate our voice, which sounds kind of scary. But I'm curious, Josie, what are your thoughts on the technology?
Yeah, it's very similar to you. I've started using a lot of these tools myself for my business, and actually, I use them for the podcast. But one of the things that I learned is if you send the single track audios to and send it up to ChatGPT, you can actually have it pull quotes from the audios. I send the single tracks because it can't differentiate between voices yet. So I usually send the individuals, but like that's been a great use for it. And so I think there's a lot of amazing potential, right? I think there's a lot of fear. Oh my gosh, is every software engineer going to just lose their job tomorrow or in 6 months from this? And I think very similar to when AI first came out, let's say like 20 years ago, the big fear was, oh my gosh, AI is going to take and robots are going to take over factory jobs. And that's not what happened. In fact, so the biggest progress in a lot of robotics has been where the robots are really helping humans do their factory jobs either more safer, faster, more efficiently, but it's really in collaboration with a human, right? We still don't even have self-driving cars really that are functional, right? And so I think again, it's the people who are going to be most successful with AI are the ones who are leveraging it to help them do their job or whatever it is they're doing in life more efficiently.
Yeah, I think that it is one of those revolutionary technologies that come along every few decades. The last one was really mobile smartphones. That was one of the biggest leaps in terms of technology and the way we use technology day to day. So I imagine this being similar to that. And even before mobile smartphones, we had the internet. So I think that this is in its infancy right now. I think a lot of alarms have been raised by many researchers, and I think you might have heard about the 6 month moratorium. A lot of people signed on to that. We had people like Steve Wozniak, folks who really legitimately are concerned about the technology, to Elon Musk, who I think he just wanted a head start or catch up rather for his own AI company. But I did hear that the EU is already working on some regulations. So I do think that in the US, we need to really get started on it because I'm not convinced that companies are going to regulate themselves. As you can see, all the consequences now with social media that really did not have a lot of strong regulation, and a lot of negativity came out of that. So yeah, I think that's one of my thoughts that I had, around this technology. I do think it's going to unlock a lot of value and different experiences for folks that, yeah, either it makes their own job a lot easier, or it might enable new things that we haven't even thought about. And so, I've been thinking about that a lot, and also about how the technology even works, especially the LLMs, the large language models, because it's like really feeding on data on the internet. And the internet has so much information that it simulates human, whether it's written communication or audio, music, and so on. I think that requires a certain amount of resources because it is a lot of cloud computing cost and energy. I suspect that we can only push it to a certain limit where the cost of this is going to skyrocket to a point where you can't really learn as quickly anymore. But I've also heard about small language models like Llama by Meta, where you feed in smaller sets of data that actually have less bias, because if you kind of open it up to the internet, there's actually more, I guess, garbage going in, so you have garbage coming out. But if you're able to kind of pick and choose the right kinds of data to go in that are more unbiased, then you probably have higher quality output from those models. So I think there's a lot of great research going into that, and yeah, we should definitely touch upon some of the things around bias. But when I start thinking about if we hit this wall with compute costs and energy costs, I think the next big unlock is around quantum computing. I don't know if you've ever seen a photo of a quantum computer, but it's it's kind of like the old mainframes. It's massive. But it's like, because right now the way that we have hardware, it's based on a transistor, which is just ones and zeros. So you can only store so much information in a binary format. The interesting thing about quantum computing is that you can store more than that. There are way more states. It's just not very reliable, I think. That's the problem. So in theory, you could store so much more data. You could crunch so much more information to teach these models. So that's just my personal prediction where this is going.
Yeah, and absolutely. I think there's a lot of things we need to think about, everything from like, hey, how do we even keep computing things? But yeah, going back to touching on some of the things you mentioned, bias, right? Absolutely. I think the two big issues that we need to think about, and this is like potentially where regulation, and I don't think we're going to see companies doing this themselves, right? Which is why we do potentially need regulation, is there's so much bias on the internet today. And so now we're just propagating that bias. And because it's an AI, what it's propagating may or may not be accurate. So the additional challenge that AI is causing is now, not only do we have biased information floating around the internet, we potentially have a lot more misinformation that was computer generated floating around the internet. And in fact, before we started recording, we were just talking about the fact that ChatGPT has had its first lawsuit, actually. And so Brian Hood was a whistleblower who actually had been praised for helping expose a worldwide bribery scandal that was linked to Australia's National Reserve Bank. But when you asked ChatGPT about his role, ChatGPT actually gave him a completely skewed and opposite version and falsely stated that he was convicted of paying briberies to foreign officials. And so that's the first lawsuit against ChatGPT. So it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. But it's not even, it gets worse in some cases, right? ChatGPT actually invented a fake sexual harassment story involving a real law professor, and actually cited a Washington Post article that did not exist as evidence. And I think these things are so crucial to make sure we're considering. Is a 6-month moratorium the right answer? Like, I don't know, right? I actually think it's what if we, instead of taking a moratorium, we actually focus on addressing these issues? And so, yeah, I think there definitely needs to be regulation and thinking about how do we leverage these long term. And then on the confidentiality side, we actually had talked about this, I think, a few weeks back. I used to work at Apple, and one of the things I think a lot of people may not know is that Siri, for example, does a lot of what is the more confidential and proprietary information processing actually on device. So any of the Siri models that have to do with, for example, your contacts, that's actually all done locally on device. So that information isn't getting back into the large model. And so that is how privacy is kept. And that is a huge issue with these large language models. I forget what company, but I already saw one company accidentally had its source code end up in ChatGPT because its engineers were leveraging it. And so I think that's the other piece we really need to be solving with these models is how do we do this in a privacy centric way?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of warnings if you do use ChatGPT, Bard, or Bing in particular, where it's text based. It does say, please don't put anything confidential, but I think there's a temptation definitely by engineers to throw in code so it can help debug. And what does that mean? It means, yeah, you're sharing this information back in, it gets fed back into the model. So that can then end up on the other side of the world when someone asks a question on maybe solving a problem that there's a proprietary solution that you are inserting there. So yeah, I do think that GitHub, Copilot, they're working on something that maybe isolates that type of data from flowing back into the models. And I can imagine when this gets integrated into things like the Google suite of tools like Google Docs, Gmail, that's gonna need to happen as well, because I would hate for like my private email, like I'm writing a message and wanting to leverage maybe some of those tools for that message to somehow get like reused in the model. That I think there needs to be a lot stronger privacy rules around how all of this data is getting used. So that's one thing. The other thing related to that actually is around images in particular. And this is something that I think, was it Midjourney or Stable Diffusion? One of Getty Images was the one who saw that they had scraped their photos and in fact tried to regenerate some of the images. You could see kind of like the Getty Images logo watermark kind of like a little messed up in the generated image. But yeah, they're suing because they took copyrighted images and put it into their model. And is that a copyright violation?
Yeah. And this is a conversation I actually have a lot with my husband because he works on the legal compliance side and does copyright enforcement. He's not a lawyer, but does a lot of the DMCA enforcement. And so he knows a lot about how these laws work, right? And so he's actually been following specifically this court case quite a bit. And there's two issues, and we need to actually consider them separately. One is obviously it's pretty clear cut that they scraped things that they didn't have the license to use. So I think that part of this lawsuit, very clear cut. Now, is it actually copyright infringement? Like that is actually where it becomes much more interesting because yes, you've been able to see like the blurred Getty, but they were actually having a very hard time being able to trace it exactly back and say, and there was enough original evidence to make it a copyright infringement. And current copyright law states that AI generated content is not copyrightable. So this goes back to like all of those computer generated NFTs going for like, hundreds or thousands of dollars, right? Well, guess what? Like nobody actually owned the copyright to that. Sorry. And again, you mentioned Copilot. I think there's some big GPL issues there potentially with, hey, is GPL code going to end up in your source base? And now you're going to have to open source your code just because of some code that you got from Copilot. So absolutely, I think we're going to need to see an evolution of the DMCA to account for artificial intelligence.
Yeah, that's such a good point about the data that goes into Copilot. Another source of a lot of information information is social media. So Reddit announced, I think it was this week, that they are going to start charging for API access. And I think a subset of API access in particular for people or companies who are using this to train their models. And I think that's the right move. It's like it shouldn't be for free. I think Twitter might have started doing that as well, where API access is being restricted, if not completely taken away. And so I do think that companies who perhaps have a lot of social content might be wary of their users' content being used for training different models.
Yeah, and I think like back in the day when Facebook's graph used to just be open, like I think we're starting to see this now. Like, hey, and if I was Reddit, I wouldn't want people just scraping my API. That's a huge cost to me and no benefit for my company, right? So absolutely, I very much agree companies should be charging for API access so these LLMs aren't just scraping their data. And I think, we touched on this earlier, but one of the things I had wanted to talk about today is how have we been using ChatGPT and how can we leverage it as a technology leader? So, for myself, I've been using it a lot for my business and building my personal brand. Everything from, like I said earlier, having it help create a first draft of show notes or, hey, find me some interesting quotes. I think one of the key things I've learned is the way you write prompts is the biggest difference between whether you're going to get something that's great or something that's garbage. And you also need to, again, it is a model. You need to actually train it on what you want. So my most useful versions of how I end up using ChatGPT is by having a conversation with it and saying like, hey, I want this. And then it'll give me something. I'm like, no, I actually want you to tweak it this way. And so I think a lot of people don't realize like you need to be conversational with this and have a lot of back and forth. But ChatGPT has been great for, hey, rough drafts of my social media posts. Tell me about the potential problems my clients might be needing to solve. Or, hey, I'm going to do a live next week. What are some of the topics I might want to touch on in my live, right? And I'm not saying, like, do not just use the copy that's coming out of ChatGPT directly. It's usually not great, but I am not a writer by trade. And so for me, having a rough draft that I can then edit and add my voice to it, like makes such a big difference versus just staring at a blank screen.
That's the same thing. I have writer's block. It's hard for me to get started, but I have found ChatGPT in particular pretty good at getting me started with a template of some sort or scaffolding. I've been using Midjourney and also DALL-E to generate some images for presentations. So instead of trying to look up stock photos, which was the old way, I would do things like, I need a photo of this to insert into my presentation. Like I just tell one of these AIs to generate me something, and it's generally pretty good. And you can iterate on it a few times too. And then recently I used it to prototype something. I haven't coded HTML and JavaScript in a while. And I'm like, yeah, I could just like go search how to create a web service again and, write all the code for it. But I just asked ChatGPT to do it and it actually worked. It was like, I didn't need something super fancy. It was just like bare bones. And yeah, I did a pretty good job. So yeah, I'm going to see if I can try this out with like GitHub Copilot and others and see what does it do a better job maybe.
Yeah, actually, one of my friends who's a coach, she had an Excel spreadsheet that she used with a lot of her clients on helping them kind of figure out how their business metrics worked. And she fed that into ChatGPT and it actually created a web-based version of it for her that she was able to deploy. And like, she's not a coder. Like, yeah, she had to tweak it a little bit and it had some bugs and she had to go back and forth. So she had to be at least a little willing to get into the technical side. But like, she's not an engineer and she like was able to get this like web product coded up for her by ChatGPT. So that I think is an a really interesting use case. And also, it can do things like, oh, I don't remember exactly how to write this Excel formula, plop it in there, right? So, even for little things like that, just similar to how you mentioned, like you don't remember exactly how to start a web service, you don't want to go have to look that back up again. It's great for kind of helping you start things. So, those have definitely been some of the other use cases I've used for it. And Jordana, I know that you asked ChatGPT some interesting retaining wit questions. So, what are some of the answers that you got from Chat for our podcast?
I asked a really basic question around how to retain women in tech. And it gave me like a paragraph. It wasn't like extravagant or anything, but let me read it to you. Retaining women in tech can be achieved through a variety of initiatives, such as creating a more inclusive and diverse workplace, providing opportunities for professional development and advancement, and offering flexible work arrangements. Additionally, offering mentorship and sponsorship programs can help women navigate the industry and develop their careers. It's also important to address and combat unconscious bias and discrimination in the workplace. Creating a culture where diversity and inclusivity is valued and promoted can also encourage more women to join and stay in the tech field. So, I think it does a pretty good job summarizing a lot of the topics we talk about on this podcast, but it doesn't actually provide any answers on how to do any of it.
Yeah, it is very dry, right? And I
Yes.
think that's the other thing. Like a lot of the copy that you're going to get out of this is going to be very dry. It's going to be very summary. Now you can get it to tweak things. I did learn that you can say, "Hey, here's some of my previous content, like write in my voice." Or if you've been writing for a while, actually ChatGPT seems to understand who I am, which is kind of interesting without me having to feed in stuff. So maybe I've just been writing enough that it's fed in some of my content. I thought it was interesting that it actually touched on sponsorship
Yes.
programs.
Yes.
That one, because again, a lot of times women are over mentored and under sponsored. So I thought that was actually interesting that it did end up touching on that. But again, it's giving you a pretty generic text. And if you posted this somewhere, like nobody is going to resonate with this content. But again, it could give you a lot of ideas if you wanted to start researching all of these different potentials. You got a place to start from.
Yeah, I actually thought that it would give me a really biased answer
Mhm.
because I'm kind of coming at this with a lot of skepticism.
Mhm.
And yeah, it surprised me that it did touch on some things that were actually truly important to the work that we would need to do to retain more women in tech. And so that stood out to me. When I did dig deeper, so I did ask it a follow-up question. What should women do if they're thinking of quitting tech? I won't read you the whole thing because it's quite long, but it did have really specific advice for women on what they need to do. And I thought that it's kind of a little unfortunate because it put way more of the emphasis on what women themselves had to change versus something that's more systemic, right? Seeking help from sponsors or allies on what they can do to provide that support.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think this is where the bias, I think, in these LLMs is not explicit. It's more the nuances, right? And so, again, and not to say that this was a biased answer per se, but again, it was putting more of the emphasis on like what the woman should do because it wasn't addressing the fact of the systemic issues that we have, which means we have to have the allies and sponsors helping solve these problems. And again, the AIs don't always understand and pick up these nuances, which is goes back to my earlier point. We can't just trust AI. I think I saw an article recently where one of the major news networks was actually having the AI generate some of its, I forget if it was articles or some of its pieces for it. They actually ended up having to go back and apologize because, again, some of it was misinformation or it was just wrong or potentially slightly biased. And so I think this really shows there's so much potential and power in AI, but I think we have a long ways to go before we could fully be trusting AI to take care of things for us.
Yeah, one of the biggest use cases for AI, and this has been I don't know. It goes back to the days of Eliza. I don't know if you remember that.
Hmm.
The therapist,
Oh,
the
yeah.
virtual therapist, where it would just like repeat the question back to you. So yeah, I'm sure you might be thinking about this too, like from a coaching perspective. Could this replace a coach? Could this replace a therapist? And I've seen a lot of attempts at doing this, and maybe there are some people who are fine with talking to a virtual therapist, but I don't know if it would replace someone's need for human connection that a real therapist would provide.
And I think what we're going to see, and you touched on this so beautifully, is we're going to actually see more of a premium in human interaction, right? Because I think we want that. And guess what? There is energy behind the human connection and two people talking to each other that you're never going to. An AI has no energy it is producing and creating, right? And so you will always potentially resonate so much more with a human being who can help you with these things than an AI, even if the AI gives you the right answer. And I think this actually goes back to even using it for copy and stuff too, right? When you are sitting down to write something, you are putting energy into that as you're creating the content. And there is none of that when the AI is doing it. And so I think we're going to start seeing potentially a shift where, yeah, maybe we'll see a ton of things get moved to AI, but then there's going to actually be a premium for, oh, but you can
Yeah.
have the human version of this.
Yeah, I think there's some pros and cons to that. And I've heard of some of the pros being, yeah, it becomes way more accessible to be able to access this type of service or information. But it also introduces inequality where that premium is going to cost. And so it's going to be only the wealthy people who would be able to pay for that human backed service.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of inequality happening. I mean, especially in the United States with everything that's been going on. And so this could be potentially another area where this shows up. So going back to whether we need to be taking a moratorium of this stuff, I don't know that that's the right answer, but should we be really understanding the implications of this long term? Absolutely.
I am excited to reconnect on this topic in our next season and really invite some guesses on who can speak to this in more expert detail. So I think a lot might happen between that time. So that's going to be an exciting thing that we'll keep on top of.
Absolutely. Jordana, it was great wrapping up this season with you and looking forward to next one.
Yep. See ya.
Bye.
This podcast comes to you in collaboration with the SheTO community. Did you know that less than 9% of engineering exec roles are held by women? SheTO is on a mission to change that. SheTO is a private network for women and non-binary engineering leaders with the goal of accelerating careers of our members and building their high-powered network. Learn more at sheto.org.
Thanks for listening to this latest episode of the Retaining WIT podcast. You can keep up with our episodes at retainingwit.com, on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast shows. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a review so we can grow our audience. Thank you.